a special resolution. Now you don't exist unless you're recorded.
Okay. All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to start off with a quick introduction. Professor Backer is a W. Richard and Mary Eshelman Faculty Scholar, Professor of Law and International Affairs at Pennsylvania State University. He teaches courses in corporate law, corporate social responsibility, and responsible business conduct. He has lectured in Latin America, Europe, Australia, and Asia. In addition to journal articles and contributions to collected multi-authored works, he has published over 100 articles and book chapters in journals in the US, Latin Americas, China, and Europe. His short essays may be found on his blog site, Law at the End of the Day. Please join me in welcoming Professor Backer.
Got over 100 articles. I think I'm going to retire at this point. Anyway, welcome. Thank you all for taking time out of your day to come here. Lecture about sovereignty, actually, and its peculiarities, not just in the Asian context, but in an Asian Marxist-Leninist context, in an Asian Marxist-Leninist context with a globalizing overlay. And hopefully by the end of this, we'll have enough material and perhaps sufficient provocation to have a nice discussion around the material. So the title of this thing is Conceptualizing Emerging Structures of Transnational Governance, right, in an era of divided sovereignty. And that's really what we're going to be looking at. Concepts, we're going to be looking at what's emerging. We're going to be looking at how this thing, transnational governance, whatever that means, and we're going to see if we can figure that out a little bit, means, and divided sovereignty. The Europeans understand this to their irritation and dismay, because it's really coming to bite them. The Chinese are now understanding this in a very different way, and the Americans, well, we'll talk about the Americans in a bit. I'll save that little nugget for last. And we're going to do that in a context that was extraordinary, both extraordinary at the time it started and now in retrospect, even more extraordinary, this 1 year period. And it was literally almost exactly a year from the beginning of this protest, massive protest. I was there. This is June 9th. 2019, and I was standing on a bridge over one of the main streets on Hong Kong Island. 2 million people walking down, protesting the extradition law. And I was doing some work for one of the governmental agencies, and everyone was flipping out. They were afraid they were going to have to put police at the hotel and stuff. But it was extraordinary, very peaceful. And what you see here is essentially the way my talk is going to go. You've got the people down there. You've got a bunch of people up here looking. Some of them are recording. Some of them are assessing. We have no idea how well. We're beginning to get an idea how useful technology, especially facial recognition, was with respect to the consequences. And you have here not just people who may be Asian, but you also have people who are not. And everyone is making it their business to see what's going on. Not working. Uh-oh.
Click back onto the PowerPoint.
All right.
Just click once and then this would work, or now
Oh, okay. Excellent.
that would also work.
All right. And so all of this then, over the course of the year, I basically wrote a diary. This was just a fascinating moment in history, especially with respect to the development of international law, with respect to the development of international treaty law, and much more importantly, within the specific context here of the development of both Chinese Marxist-Leninism and Chinese Marxist-Leninist internationalism, all of this converging here. And so over the course of the year, from the time of the start of the protest to the passage of the national security and national anthem law that shuts all of this down by July of 2020, I developed a series of kind of in-time essays as I wrote them. I had no idea what was going to transpire. And what was produced was this thing, 1998 on Amazon. Feel free to buy. So this is actually my pitch. I'm done now. So go buy the book. And then that'll tell you what was actually going on. So I did this, and the book examines this conflict represented both within the physical space of Hong Kong and within its conceptual space, bringing in both the theories and applications of indigenization of culture within regions, the development of Marxist-Leninism, Chinese, not European, which is very different, the development of international law in a variety of strains, the European strain, the strain coming out of the shops in Geneva and New York, and of course, the American strain, all of which are revolving around 2-3 million people who to some extent are oblivious, and for some of whom this becomes a critical dialogue, not just to Beijing, but outward, right? And so all right, sorry. It's killing my flow here.
Or you can hit the space bar on the keyboard.
Oh, okay. Oh my God, yay. All right. And so what I want to do in the course of the, and well, let me back up for a second. And so out of this book, there are a number of really interesting, and the diary in effect, that is the 31 essays in the book, there are a number of fairly interesting themes that then run through the year. For this presentation, I've chose one, and the theme that I'm looking at is the way in which these Hong Kong protests and then the discursive developments around it, what they have to say about sovereignty and the understanding of the nature and the application of sovereignty in a complex intergovernmental structure like that between mainland China and Hong Kong. To get there, I'm going to spend just a little bit of time. I keep forgetting that, well, I just obsessed about this for a year. Most people kind of episodically look at what was going on. So I'm saying Hong Kong, Hong Kong, Hong Kong. And all you remember is maybe 6 New York Times headlines, and then it goes into oblivion because you're all concerned about something else. So let me give you just a quick timeline so that that will put this in context. And then we'll go into the core of the issue, which is sovereignty, both in terms of its contestation and in terms of the consequences of the choices of different modalities of sovereignty among different actors, both within Hong Kong and then transporting that out more generally to the way in which these actors now are burdened with these conceptions of sovereignty as they go forward with respect to other issues and other problems around the world. All right, the Hong Kong context. And it doesn't start in 2019. Of course, you can trace this back to the year 0. For our purposes, 2019 could be traced back most directly to the umbrella movement, a series of protests in 2014, and roughly between, let's say, 2006, the financial meltdown, and 2019, the relationship between the local authorities in Hong Kong, who are more or less wary of the central authorities in Beijing, and the people of Hong Kong, including the leaders of a variety, and there was a number of different political factions, social and cultural factions within Hong Kong, existed in a kind of semi-turbulent dynamic state. No one was happy with this. The central authorities thought that the people of Hong Kong were getting a little bit too independent. The local authorities were finding it harder and harder to control the local political activity. And in the process, the local factions, collectives, communities, especially of young people, who were looking increasingly at what they saw was the inevitable movement of time to 2047 and the end of the treaty between Britain, the Sino-British joint declaration of, I forget the year, 1980, something or other, that ends in 2047. We're viewing that with increasing alarm as they themselves began to develop their own sensibilities of what it meant to be part of the political community of Hong Kong, which was increasingly distinct in their minds from what it meant to be part of the political community within the mainland. Right, so there's this dynamic. It erupts, and it erupts in a very, very telling way during the umbrella movement in 2014 with kids parked. I was there for that too. Kids parked on the freeway. And for those of you who've been in Hong Kong, you know that the one thing that you do not want to do is shut any of these arteries down because the city just stops. And they parked themselves on the Central Expressway on Hong Kong Island. They made a mess of things. It took a while. Everyone got revenge about 2 years later, but there was this dynamic tension. All of this then, but stable. Businesses were doing well. The central government developed a tolerance. They hated it, but they developed a tolerance for this. The local authorities felt that they had the situation more or less under control. So you have a situation which, for a Marxist-Leninist regime and for Asia, is fairly unusual. This system of contained and sort of performative dynamic unhappiness, where it's going in all kinds of directions. Well, at this point, the central authorities had a number of long-term plans with a number of particular statutes. One of them, which had caused tremendous problems, was the extradition law. The central authorities had already earned the enmity of large portions of what would become the protester community by appearing to come in and borrow people in China, in Hong Kong, and then they find themselves in China, in the mainland for violating Chinese law while they were in Hong Kong, and supposedly Chinese law didn't apply in that context. People were getting very, very mad about this. In May, April or May, I think, maybe a little earlier, the local authorities then put out the new extradition law. Furious. Everyone is furious because they say, oh my God, this is it. We are going to become mainland China. The constellation of protest of I have to be careful. You don't want to call them dissidents. You don't want to call them, they will become protesters, of those who were opposed to this, managed to do what people thought was relatively impossible, and certainly since the umbrella movement, they all kind of converged. And the result of this convergence was 2 million people, or certainly several 100,000 people. Are still disputing how many, but the streets were full. Several 100,000 people demonstrating against the extradition law. That was made worse on June 12th when the protesters surrounded the legislative building. And again, think about this. At the time, we thought in the West, the press was very positive about this. Oh my God, the protesters, they think that their democracy is being stolen from them, and they go and surround the building and prevent the lawmakers from going in. This is grand and marvelous. Pause, ... think January 6th, right? And ask yourself, in the West, this was grand, possibly because this was happening at the LegCo building in Hong Kong and not at Congress, right? With respect to people who, for the West, on June 12th, were viewed as freedom fighters and protectors of democracy as they saw it, on January 6th, not quite, right? And that is one of the issues. Again, when we were talking about sovereignty, keep that in mind. Perspective will make all the difference in the world, depending on both who's doing it where and who is doing the judging. So June 12th, this comes up. The central authorities now get very concerned, as do the local authorities. There's a lot of violence, and the violence picks up from there. At that point, both the central authorities and the protesters argue that both sides are engaging in fundamentally illegal and human rights breaching activities. The Hong Kong government and the central authorities become lawless. The protesters become, in the classical sense, outlaws, that is, outside of the law, and therefore they can be suppressed by any means necessary. That's the threat. No one does this. The discursive, and this is a big part of the book, the discursive development here about lawfulness, lawlessness, and therefore the legitimacy of action, including violence, gets developed between June and September. By September, everyone is tired, and there's a lot of posturing. By the middle of August, the Chinese central authorities had put a huge number of troops in Shenzhen, which is literally across the border from Hong Kong. And they didn't say anything, but the idea was, well, these folks can march into Hong Kong. Everyone gets nervous. By September, it's clear that we've developed some kind of status quo. Protesters are happening on a daily basis. There are days when they shut the airport down. The central authorities develop a position. These people are no longer citizens or legitimate components of the Hong Kong polity. And finally, Carrie Lam and the local authorities say, okay, we will withdraw the extradition law, which is what started all of this. The protesters say, too late. Now we have 5 demands, not just one. We have 5 demands, including the demand that you recognize effectively that we are an autonomous people whose civil and political rights and their traditions ought to be protected like any other self-referencing peoples, even within the ultimate sovereign authority of China. We are allowed this under principles of international law and irrespective of the whatever treaty got us to do this. The local authorities and the central authorities, there was no way they're going to do this. And that was okay because the protesters ultimately got the last word in at the last local elections before COVID. The protesters had a resounding victory, not just the center and center left. I don't know if left or right makes sense here, but let's assume center left, that is the autonomy people, not only got a resounding victory, but those who advocated not just protected autonomy well past 2047, but independence as well. And that was flipping the government out, especially the central authorities. They win these sweeping elections. Nothing else is happening for a while. There's stasis. And then there's divine intervention. Kamikaze, the Japanese word for divine wind. This is a divine virus. It looked like by the beginning of January that the central authorities were going to have to take a very deep breath and concede something, which was inconceivable a year before the centenary of the establishment of the Chinese Communist Party. This was just, in terms of losing face, was just horrible. And no one believed that they'd actually do it, but they might have had to kind of eat crow, but the virus comes. And coronavirus changes everything because coronavirus allows the state to do what the state has done everywhere in ways that before 2019, no sets of freedom-loving peoples, especially liberal democratic peoples, thought was either possible or consonant with the core principles of liberal democracy. And that is they took all of their populations, herded them into specific places and shut them up, managing them for the best of all possible reasons, and that is protection against this little bug. Well, it wasn't just Australia and New Zealand, and to some clumsy extent, the Americans and the Europeans who were doing this. The Chinese were doing this, and they did it quite well. And of course, with a population that is now very conflicted. Because you might say, well, yeah, on a conceptual level, you're killing our civil and political rights. On a physical level, we'll have one last hurrah, we'll get coronavirus and die, and that may not be useful either. So there's this huge conflict, but effectively the local government now gets control. And in that process, the protest and the power of the protest, which is based on their control of the streets, dissipates to the point where by May, the central authorities think that without much cost, they can make a move. And the move they made is twofold. One, from the protesters' perspective, it's a usurpation. From Beijing's perspective, it is merely them acting muscularly on the basis of their interpretation of the nature of the autonomy agreement between China and Hong Kong. The National People's Congress, at the direction of the Communist Party and the central authorities, produced 2 bills, the National Anthem Law, which is meant to further the Great Patriotic Campaign, in which Hong Kong patriots would be welcomed in as part of the governing demos, and everyone else would be treated as an enemy of the state or a spy or someone who has to be re-educated. This goes back to Maoist thinking from the 30s and 40s, right? And they passed the national security law at the time. They patted the West and said, don't worry, we've got 3 people in mind. And of course, between the 2 of them, it's transformed everything. Hong Kong is now not what it was. This was then met by any number of reactions, the usual phlegmatic reactions by the part of the Geneva, New York establishment, the flowery but ultimately empty approaches of the Europeans, especially the European Union, who are very good with words. Well, they're very good with words. And then the Americans, who do what the Americans always do. It's amazing. Every country will always act to type. And the Americans, of course, did what the Americans are always good at. Besides posturing, they go to Congress and they pass a bunch of legislation, most of which involves either allowing people in, the Brits did this as well, to the chagrin of the Chinese, to let people in, or to specifically sanction. We now know from our disaster of a Cuba and Iran embargo that collective embargoes don't work, but everyone's got a taste for targeted interventions, just like we have all a taste now for targeted killings of people with drones. That was brought in by the Obama administration, and now everyone kind of likes it, although they say that they don't. But we also, the analogy is we have targeted sanctions as well, and that's what the Americans are doing, including at this moment where Congress is considering 3 additional measures, plus the possibility of boycotting the Beijing Olympics. So that's where we are, and this is in a sense why Hong Kong, at least for a moment, was a critical juncture for a lot of, and a convergence point for a lot of things that were going on at the international level with respect to law, with respect to the notion of civil and political rights, with respect to the way in which health and safety had to be balanced with, and the authority of the state with respect to the management and disposal of its populations in the context of either liberal democratic or Marxist-Leninist regimes. So all of this is cooking. But that's all I'm going to say about it. That's another lecture. But out of all of this surrounding, kind of framing this discussion is a discussion of sovereignty, right? And there's all kinds of sovereignty. I'm not going to spend very much time on this. Sovereignty is one of those words that people use, and it can mean, like the caterpillar said to Alice when he was smoking, I think it was hashish, but then it became illegal. So then he started smoking cigars. That whatever it was he was smoking, sovereignty is whatever it is I say it is, and it is so to the extent I can make it happen. So sovereignty is collective meaning making backed by the power to enforce it among those who are unwilling, and there's any number of them. Until 1945, there was an apex notion of sovereignty, which was bound up in the majesty of the apex political unit, which was the state, right? And we built the UN system around it. Since then, since 1945, although, again, there's predecessors going back in the modern era to the question about what do you do with minorities when you break up the Austro-Hungarian, the Russian, and the German empires, and you got all these peoples running around, you got to do something with them. Can't kill them. Pause. There was a little blip between 1933 and 45, and then we went back to you can't kill them, what are we going to do with them? Which also gave rise to the enterprise of human rights, but that's a different story. But it touched on sovereignty. What are we going to do with this? And after 1945, sovereignty fractures. It fractures upwards, it fractures downwards. Sovereignty gets delegated, except don't tell this to the Polish Supreme Court. Sovereignty gets delegated up to transnational units like the European Union. That was a great experiment, or to regional human rights organizations like the OAS to some extent, the European Convention Group, and now the African Union, which is moving more muscularly in this direction. It gets fractured down with respect to autonomous sovereignty, especially the very muscular movement towards indigenous sovereignty within a meta-sovereign organization backed by a number of treaties. We'll see if that actually happens. It gets privatized, right? Multinational enterprises are to some extent sovereign within those governance gaps that separate states and with respect to which the international system dares not go yet. And sovereignty can be exercised through production chains in public-private partnerships. The Belt and Road Initiative is one, the Brussels effect in Europe is the other, the America First is the other. And of course, sovereignty is always a function of power, authority, recognition, and importantly in this context, ideology, right? And so you're going to make meaning both as a function of your ability to enforce that meaning, you use it to enhance authority so that you have a basis for doing things without feeling that you are violating something. You need recognition by others because this is communal meaning making. I can have all kinds of meanings, but if I'm the only one who believes in it, then it doesn't exist. And all of this, of course, is grounded in what Sartre would have called imaginaries, what Foucault would have called biopolitics and governmentality, the ideologies, the ways in which you see and approach the world. And that becomes critically important because in this context, there are going to be three, and they are now the troublesome three. One is liberal democratic and internationalist, and that's a little fractured. The other is absolutely local and indigenized. And then the third is Marxist-Leninist. And those ideologies are all authoritative to some extent. They are to a greater extent incompatible. And they mark a huge shift in the way in which the global order has seen itself moving from the notion of the international order as a space for convergence of these notions between 1945 and 2015. The high point being 2000 and the inclusion of China within the World Trade Organization. Convergence within difference, the European Union's pioneered this. What is it? Unity and diversity. I think that's the slogan, right? That was the notion to now and it's not Mr. Trump, he's symptomatic, but not the cause. Xi, Trump, and this generation of leaders who are moving to the notion or ideologies of differentiation and detachment, which is a huge shift. We're only beginning to see the differences now. And therefore, on that basis, these differences in sovereignty are now going to make far more difference than they would have under regimes of convergence. And that's why it's kind of important to look at them. All right, so what's the umbrella concept within which these discourses of sovereignty play out? And what are their consequences? That's what we're going to look at. Well, the chapeau or the ordering framework for all of this is the one country, two systems principle, that Hong Kong was returned to China on condition that it would be sovereign territorially, but it agreed to respect that the Hong Kong political economic system would be different from and autonomous of the Marxist-Leninist system then developing within the People's Republic. Chinese, territorially, ideologically, autonomous. Right? That's the notion. The question, but of course, you do one country, two systems to a lawyer, and you say, oh my God, I've got enough here to supply me with fees for ambiguity until my grandchildren go to college. There's a lot. And that's essentially what's happened here, because over the course of time between the 1990s and 2020, that was the issue. And here, of course, is Deng Xiaoping. Now, notice this picture. I love this picture. Right, this is the when they signed the joint declaration, the Sino-UK joint declaration. You have Margaret Thatcher, of course, who's going to take the front row. You've got I forget who is the president, but the real power behind the throne. He's there. Where is he? See the little man off here? It's Deng Xiaoping. That's the architect of this thing, in a sense. So the picture is actually emblematic of what is going on. The British and the outward face of Chinese Marxist-Leninism is pointing in one direction. What is actually going to go on is in the background, and it's going to take time for it to be exposed. And that really is a metaphor for what's going on. So you've got the one country, two systems principle was defined or hammered out in the 1985 Sino-British Joint Declaration. It was the blueprint for returning Hong Kong to China, and it's the interpretation of what it means. The document isn't very long. I think it's like 6 or 7 pages of dense print in English and in Chinese. And right from the beginning, both sides took very different positions. This is the starting point, not the ending point, for the discussion of sovereignty. All right. The Chinese position was that the Hong Kong autonomy was consigned to the discretion of Chinese central authorities, that territorial sovereignty meant that they had the dispositive right to interpret what that autonomy meant and what the nature of that agreement was, right? Guided by the joint declaration as an initial matter, but ultimately solely subject to and eventually embedded within the constitutional traditions of the People's Republic. By 2017, the position was, well, look, the Sino-British Joint Declaration was a bill of sale. We paid, you got what you got, and now we're done and we've moved on. That was their view. The UK position was almost the opposite, that Hong Kong autonomy was guaranteed from and for the duration of the term of the joint declaration. It was an international instrument like the Treaty of Amsterdam or the Treaty of Rome in 1955. It effectively confined or constrained Chinese sovereignty over Hong Kong, at least with respect to operations, but not with respect to territory. And that therefore, at least until 2047, when the treaty was over, who was sovereign in Hong Kong? The Chinese were territorially sovereign, but the exercise, the operational sovereignty of Hong Kong was a matter of international law until 2047, when the Chinese can come in and do whatever they want. All right. And so that was the opening of positions. By the time 2020 rolls around, we've got 3 positions. And that's what I'm going to talk about for the next 10 or 15 minutes. And then I will have exhausted myself and you, and hopefully we can have a little bit of a discussion. The first is that from this is what I call internal sovereign partitioning under or within a superior national constitutional order. That's the Chinese position, that we can partition sovereignty, but Hong Kong is no different than, let's say, American Indian tribes. They can be sovereign as and to the extent and subject to the constitutional limitations that we ourselves put in, that we ourselves can get rid of in accordance with the rules that we have for amending the Constitution. Yeah, they come and it goes, it's a Chinese matter and only a Chinese matter, subject only to the legalities of Chinese constitutionalism. The British position, no, it is not endogenous. Sovereignty in this case is exogenous. It's a sovereign partitioning that is guided by international law, which constrains and limits the reach of Chinese constitutional law. Chinese constitutional law must bend the knee to China's voluntarily accepted international agreements. Why? We're merchants. You bargain. That was the price you paid for buying the merchandise that you wanted, which was the territory and peoples and productive capacity of Hong Kong. Well, you bought it, you own it. Here's the bill of sale. You're stuck with it. And that means that you're stuck with international law as a constraint to your own ability to march in and change Hong Kong as you like. And then the third, the indigenous position was that no. All of this is shared. All of this is shared. And it's shared in a way that leaves a space not for the international community. So they're sitting in, and they are very overpriced restaurants in Geneva, although sometimes food is very good. Not those people, not the people who are sitting in equally really nice restaurants in Beijing and enjoying themselves, but the local people themselves are the people who ought to be sovereign. We don't think about local people anymore. For a year, the Hong Kong people did, and not anymore. Right. So those are the three: inside, outside, shared, and local. All right, so we're going to look at all of this. I put this up. This, by the way, during the imperial period in China, sovereignty had 12 attributes, and these were built into. I'm not going to do this now, but if you look at this carefully, all of the 12 attributes of sovereignty, as understood in classical imperial Chinese ideology, were woven into the imperial garments around the dragon. Everything from longevity, order, prosperity, and the like, and you'd see them all in there, and that's essentially what we're going to be looking at now. So what's the Chinese position? The Chinese position is very simple. When you talk about one country, two systems, what you really, let me translate it for you into better English: one country over two systems, right? That's their position. It's an alignment of territorial sovereignty with effective control of political life. Yeah, you can be as different as we will let you. We will assess how much of a price we're willing to pay for either forcing you to conform or for letting you be yourselves. But that's a matter for us to decide in Beijing, not for you. So autonomy is absolutely discretionary, constrained only by the vanguard, in this case, the Chinese Communist Party, and their political authority, as well as by whatever law that comes out that is aligned with Chinese Communist Party ideological views. And the point of all of this is to avoid separatism and to view this as a purely internal matter. All right, that's been the Chinese position, and all of that ultimately in aid of the importation into Hong Kong of the basic structures of Chinese Marxist-Leninism. The principles of which, including the central contradiction, which arose after 2019, which is a focus on more equal distribution of productive forces, and the overarching principle of stability and prosperity. There is no stability when you have this crazy system of dynamic tension that had been evolving in Hong Kong since 2010. They hated it. Right? They hated it, and they viewed it as an impediment to prosperity, which was the driving force in their ideology. The protesters, on the other hand, said, no, two systems over one country. That's what we have. Hong Kong's autonomy is inherent in the formula for reunification, but respect for the evolving separate customs and traditions of the Hong Kong people cannot be inhibited either by Chinese indigenous documents or by international treaty. The people are entitled to their own development, to their own autonomy, and this is the word that really set everyone's teeth on edge in Beijing, to their, what are the two words that most governments hate to hear? It's usually hyphenated. Self-determination. That is like saying that I've done all kinds of outrageous things to your parents. Right? Self-determination is the one thing no one wants to hear, but it's essentially what they did. So the baseline for autonomy is the joint declaration, but it's not the limit, it's the beginning, not the end. International law is meant to protect minorities and minority rights, not the joint declaration, which was merely evidence of a broader and deeper international commitment. And if the joint declaration did not go far enough, well, then that also is flawed and has to be superseded. So in a sense, what they were arguing for is the indigenization of the Hong Kong people as something apart. For the Chinese central authorities, this is swift poison, because if you buy this, this is a big target, but you give ammunition to the even bigger target, Taiwan. Right, and that becomes absolutely unacceptable. And they would be willing to pay a very high price to avoid putting themselves in a position that make that they themselves give ammunition, sovereign ideology ammunition to the Taiwanese, to then move towards greater autonomy, self-determination, and it's a small leap from self-determination to being Kosovo. Well, they're models. No one likes it, except maybe the Germans like Kosovo for some reason, but there you go. So the indigenization of the Hong Kong people, and the international community has an obligation to make this so. If they fail to do this, then they fail to meet their own international obligations, and the international community is not worth the paper that was spent to write all this junk down. All right, the international community is a big community. Of course, they're like the Americans. You can't have, why have one position when you can have two? And indeed, they have two positions on sovereignty. Variation number one, Chinese territory, and between the two variations, there's an agreement that Chinese territorial and ultimate sovereignty will be recognized. Hong Kong is part of China, but no one cares. That's not the issue. Yeah. Hong Kong is part of China, but that begs the question. The question is, well, what does that mean in terms of operational control? Variation one, China elected to waive operational sovereignty as a price of reunification. China is bound by its contract. That contract requires a respect for the peculiarities of Hong Kong and its political system until 2047, and then bye-bye, Hong Kong. The Chinese can do whatever they want. That was the initial position of the Trump administration, and that was a position, I believe, the personal position of Mr. Trump. That was then changed as the course of events changed between the end of 2019 and 2020, and then the Americans began to adopt variation two. Right? And variation two starts the same place. Yeah, Hong Kong is Chinese territory. Operational sovereignty is constrained by international law, not merely the treaty, but the whole panoply of international law, principles, and norms, including the principle of self-determination. That's the key. Including the principle of self-determination, Hong Kong's political autonomy and constitutional order has to be internationalized to the extent of its protection and left to the Hong Kong people to decide, not the Chinese people, including the people in Hong Kong, but the people of Hong Kong as a separate autonomous community within China, right? And that autonomy has to be guaranteed under international law so that one can have, in a sense, variation two is a nice post-global imperial model where you can say, yeah, the Americans can now have sovereignty over all of Latin America, but every one of the Latin American states will have full autonomy, and there are all kinds of things that you can't do, but they remain first order dependencies and territorially subject. You're sitting here looking, oh my God, why is he saying that? But what's the difference when you tease this out to its nth degree? Those are the variations that came in. Of course, these different conceptions of sovereign ordering, right, make a significant difference. As I mentioned, the national one is a position of the Chinese central authorities harder now than it was even in 2020. The sovereign division is the position of the US, UK, to some extent the EU, and more ambiguously the international community such as it is. And then this autonomy of sovereign governance was the position of at least some cluster of the protesters. Well, what are the consequences? Almost done. What are the consequences of all of this? Well, if you buy the Chinese position, by the way, this is a great picture. This shows up in Hong Kong Harbor. This is a barge with this banner that reads "Celebrate the National Security Law" that miraculously shows up within a short time after Beijing delivers the national security law to the people of Hong Kong. And people are, if you needed a symbol for a dawn of a new day, this was it. So what do we have when you have internally administered autonomy? And this applies in China, but it's going to apply everywhere else, including the West. We're just sweeter about it. They're much more direct. You have patriotic campaigns. The national flag and the national anthem statutes made it clear that you're going to have to perform your allegiance, and that failures to perform your allegiance is a marker which can then be punished, and it can be punished in all kinds of ways. Chinese social credit. In this country, it would be the cancellation either through private markets or through relationships. In China, it's much more official, that is, it's sent through governmental agencies, but it will distinguish and produce consequences, not just political consequences, but economic consequences for falling on the right or wrong side of the great patriotic campaign. This wall of separation is now built up again to keep out. There was this huge campaign starting in June of 2019 of the black hand of foreign interference. If in fact you aren't a patriot, then chances are you are either directly or indirectly, consciously or unconsciously, a pawn of the black hand of the foreigner who is using you to undermine the stability and prosperity of China in Hong Kong, right? And so what winds up happening is you have this 1-2 punch. You have a patriotic campaign, which is a positive face of this, and then you've got this wall of separation and this notion of the black hand of foreign interference, which explains all objections to the way in which things are going. And that is then legalized. The enforcement of this is legalized in the criminal side through the national security law and through the social side by the imposition of social credit and social consequences. The empowerment of national forces. What winds up happening now is all of a sudden Hong Kong is no longer as independent. It's sort of like the difference between 1860 state power in the United States and 1920 state power. Federalism gets eviscerated. And in this case, the autonomy of the local authorities gets significantly narrowed as the National People's Congress takes more and more and more of a more granular interest in the goings on in Hong Kong. And whether you were pro or anti-Beijing, the federalism aspect of this becomes quite significant. And then you've got, as we've seen, and we're going to have our next speaker with the wolf warriors. The other consequence is the development in China of what he calls wolf warriorism, I call defensive internationalism, which is post-colonial and neo-imperial narratives and the use of both discursive and physical countermeasures, right? For the internationalist, true, and this is a great picture. This is, again, this is in Philadelphia, this is in Hong Kong, which I thought was kind of funny. So what you wind up seeing here is intergovernmentalism, multilateralism, and international organization action. On the one part, that's what we're talking about. Those are the people or the places where this administration ought to occur. We have targeted sanctions. I talked about that a little bit. And in the case of the United States, and increasingly now in Europe, since the Chinese targeted the members of the European Parliament, but it was going to happen sooner or later. What you wind up having is an alignment between sovereignty and the larger issues of relations, of changing relations between China and the other two imperial centers, the Europeans on the one, and no one likes to be called that, but there's, for better or worse, we're moving into an era of post-global imperialism. We've got three centers. If you like it, great. If you don't like it, put on your green suit, get a cigar, go to the mountains and fight it if you can. And then we'll see what happens. But alignment with this, with other bigger issues, the US-China trade relations issue, much more importantly, its alignment as its weaponization in 5th and 6th generation warfare. This is very interesting, especially in the context of lawfare used by the Chinese as well as the West. And the West loves to do this since we legalize everything. This is a really interesting area where you can weaponize sovereignty in sovereign context. And then you apply soft law figures. The UN Working Group for Business and Human Rights, for example, used the Hong Kong protests to argue that businesses had an independent, especially multinational interests, businesses had an independent, societally based responsibility to respect human rights, especially about civil and political rights, even if the international community was kind of quiet, and even in the face of the actions taken by the local and the central authorities. So through the UN guiding principles, and of course through the OECD's guidelines for multinational enterprises, which is not enforced, but enforced through national contact points embedded in the commerce ministries of most Western states. And that's become a very hot issue. So that gets us sort of to where we are now. What started out as a fairly simple, benign thing has now proven to be a quite interesting concept, the uses of which and the consequences from out of which now are we're only at the beginning stage, but promise a substantial amount of very interesting development as we move forward. If you want to read more, I have to do this. It's the only, I don't like being a salesman. Well, actually, I do like being a salesman. Buy my book. And you can read more about this. Anyway, thank you very much. And I look forward to any questions or discussions or comments. I've lulled you to say, oh, good, yes.
So I know there's a lot of examples of like other kind of semi-autonomous states within a bigger sovereign state. Compare this to anything else going on around the world?
All right, what, yes and no, this is a problem with spending too many years in law school. As I can evade it. The answer is yes, to some extent, and I've alluded to it during the course of the remarks. In a lot of ways, there are allusions here to indigenization. That is, the Hong Kong people are indigenous, and maybe, they never went this far, but it was going there, and someone is going to eventually do this, right? That they're an indigenous people that may be entitled to rights similar to, if not exactly the same as the rights and protections of indigenous people under international law. And you see that everywhere, from India to Latin America to the US and Canada, less so in Europe because the Europeans believe that they've been, the migration waves have been so many that there's no such thing as indigenous people. But then you talk to the people in Brittany and they would have or the people in Wales, and they might have a very different view of this. So you see this, and indeed, if I were sitting in Wales, or I was sitting in Brittany, or if I were sitting in the English-speaking tribal areas of Nicaragua, I would be very interested in developing and taking what the protesters started in a very offhand way and then running with it. To some extent, we see this kind of autonomy in some places. The relations with indigenous people is, of course, different in a lot of ways, but the impulse is the same. With respect to other groups, you've got autonomous territories, but again, indigenous. Beyond that, no, in the West, it's become different because certainly since 1945, what we've tended to do is to fragment human rights, which is the basis for all of this, except in the context of self-determination. And the only other place that we can see this is in the Balkans. So putting the Balkans aside, this would be the precise answer to your question is look at the Balkans. The more general answer to your question is there's a problem in under liberal democratic ideology because we have spent almost 100 years fragmenting human rights from a collective notion, a collective subject to an individual one, and therefore it becomes harder under the traditional ways in which we've come to understand and process human rights to do it from a collective perspective. Interesting things coming out of Africa, where the African Union's human rights applies to peoples as well as to individual. The African Human Rights Court has yet to really opine on this, and they're going to be very careful because African states don't mimic the traditional borders of African nations. And so you have to be very, very careful there, but it's possible.
And then also, if you are taking it from an indigenous standpoint, couldn't you also like try to have more people that just go live in Hong Kong that are from the mainland to counter those populations?
Someone's been looking at the reports. The answer to both is, yeah, the answer to both is yes. One of the things that was freaking some of the people in the protest movement was in fact just that. I'll start with the last point, that the Chinese had become more and more open about, I'll use a European term, making facts by changing the migration pattern and then using the migration patterns and the change in the composition of the demos for political and ideological effect. And that worried people. It was an underlying part of the conversation and never really surfaced very much in the discourse as exported to the West, but it was there. The indigenation issues in Taiwan are multi-level, right? Because, right, who is indigenous in Taiwan now after all of these layers of migration, conquest, and change? So you've got the indigenous Taiwanese, whose indigeneity is disputed both by the Chinese and the Japanese, the Filipinos, and the Indonesians, right? Who are these people who actually wound up going on the island, and when did they first become self-referencing? Right. you've got another group that says, oh, no, 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 the indigenous people are the Taiwanese people that were there during the time that Taiwan was Japanese. Right? It was a colony territory of Imperial China. So one of the arguments would go, of course, these arguments are horrifying to the central authorities and they wouldn't buy it, right? But that, in fact, you had until Chiang Kai-shek's army of Chinese migrated, right? They were the settler colonists, right? On a population that was all that had more or less stabilized from previous settler colonial migrations to produce an indigenous population. And certainly if they weren't indigenous before 1949, they became so after all these people came over, having lost the Civil War with in China to the Chinese Communist Party and their helpers. So in that case, you've got an internal question of indigeneity. Is only part of Taiwan indigenous? And then with respect to Taiwan as a whole, including all of those folks, is that an indigenous population for self-determination as against outsiders, in this case, the mainland? So there's two levels working here. These are, the Chinese would say these are sensitive conversations. These are sensitive conversations. I don't have the answer, but you can see where the problems would lie, and then people will bicker, and this is where you use history, and then this all dissolves into another PhD dissertation that will keep someone in a career for 30 years. Other questions? These are great questions. Yes, sir. Honestly, you're not going to like what I have to say. The honest answer is it's too late. The honest answer is too late. You should have thought of this in the 1980s, and you should have thought of the consequences. You made your deal. Now you're going to have to live with it, and the deal is plausible. Is plausible in part because a good chunk of Hong Kong was never British to begin with, was leased. And with respect to the rest, it was easy come, easy go. The imperial government had ceded that territory. It was British. The British decided in return for whatever it was that they got, only part of which we know, to cede it back. Everyone agrees that China is territorially sovereign. And the Chinese position is plausible. Now, the question then is, given all of that, are there things that you can do to influence Chinese thinking about the extent of the autonomy that they are willing to concede to Hong Kong? The answer is maybe, but it's not clear to me that anyone in Brussels, Berlin, or Washington is really thinking about this that way. Again, Hong Kong, it's sort of like Cuba. Hong Kong is important when it blows up and when it's useful, but otherwise it is a tool or a weapon in a much, much larger game. In this case, the rearrangement of the relationship between two enormously powerful, now quasi-imperial forces and how they realign their politics, their production trajectories, their economics, and their militaries. So honestly, if you would have wanted to strike a deal of some kind that would have been face-saving enough for the central authorities, you would have had to do it by December. Beyond that, with the national security law and with the shutdown effectively in protests, it's not clear right now. The momentum is almost entirely with the central authorities, not with anyone else. The only thing you can do is weaponize Hong Kong to further refine and to further project our own ideological notions of human rights, including civil and political rights, of the nature of treatment, of the nature of rule of law, and to apply it in a systematic way, to bargain for it in the context of whatever deals we're doing. you will in that context be able to gain something within Hong Kong at the margins, but much more importantly, you will be able to strengthen or to deepen your own sense of what your own ideological views and values are, not just expressed, but live. That is, you're going to be putting your money where your mouth is. And so Hong Kong, and that kind of what we can do in Hong Kong directly is very little, but in terms of its utility in a larger field of, I don't want to say combat, in a larger field of engagement. That's a nice word. In a larger field of engagement, there's still a lot that can be done, and a lot that is being done. I'm not sure that there's a lot of coordination. You've got a lot of, even in Washington, you've got a lot of voices speaking, all of whom have their own agendas. It works the same in China, except it's not reported as much as it is here, and we're used to that kind of thing. But the level of coordination here, I think, leaves a bit to be desired, much less the coordination with the Europeans. That went off track in 2016. And I mean, besides the photo ops, it's really not back on track very much. It'll probably take another year or two, assuming that the administration actually pays attention. But the administration is also now distracted with internal politics. And so chances are that the Europeans, to some extent, and they should be really mad about this, because that alignment really needs to occur, and to occur very quickly. The Europeans and everyone else is just going to be put aside until these domestic issues get sorted out, and that may take another year or two, in which case it's going to be a different field of engagement in which we work. So it's not a great answer, but I mean, there are things that you can extract from the perspective of the interests of the Americans and of the Americans and Europeans, because there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of things that can be done. But given the nature, the political situation right now, both in Europe, there's a transition in the key driver, Germany. The Brits are still, I don't know what they're doing, but they're still fine. Oh, here, I'll do it nicely. They're finding their feet. They're still finding their feet. And the Americans are completely distracted. Unlikely.
So we're out of time for today, but if you want to stay to ask questions, you might have a minute. But thank you so much for coming to speak to us.
No, and thank you, folks. You sat and listened to all of these multisyllabic words for 45 minutes, and most of you didn't sleep. This is out of. So thanks. Yeah, no, I can stick around for a couple of minutes for questions.
Yeah, so